everyone, and welcome to the Our Voices podcast, the podcast for straight partners and partners of trans people by Our Path. I'm your host, Kristen Kelbley. Our guest today is Marta Kauffman. Marta is an American television writer and producer. She is best known as the co-creator of the NBC sitcom Friends and has produced and or co-written other successful TV series, including Veronica's Closet, Jessie, and Related. She co-created the Netflix series Grace and Frankie with Howard Morris. Grace and Frankie has received several award nominations, including 5 Primetime Emmy Award nominations for Outstanding Lead Actress in a Comedy Series, a Golden Globe Award nomination for Best Actress, Television Series Musical or Comedy for Lily Tomlin, and multiple Screen Actors Guild Award nominations for Outstanding Performance by a Female Actor in a Comedy Series. Welcome to the podcast, Marta. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much, and please excuse my dog.
No problem. Sometimes we have 4-legged guests on the show, too.
I bet you do.
Well, I'm so thrilled to have you today, Marta. It's such a pleasure to have you on, and I just want to let you know that so many straight spouses are fans of Grace and Frankie, if and when they are ready to watch it. And so we're so excited to talk to you about the show and the topic, and I'm just going to jump right in with my first question, which is, how did you get the idea to write about these two women who have gay husbands?
The first step of this was that we had Lily Tomlin and Jane Fonda who wanted to do a show together. Mm-hmm. And you look at Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin, you say, what would put them in conflict at the same time that they're being drawn together by a common experience? Mm-hmm. And actually, I was sitting with my daughter in the car, and we're just sort of bouncing ideas across to each other. And she's the one who said, what if their husbands fall in love and decide to get married, and there are two women who don't like each other, who are then, as I said, bonded by this common experience? And I just thought, that's amazing. And I haven't seen it.
Right.
It hasn't been done. It seems like a really, as far as television goes, a rich area to explore, not only because it hasn't been explored before, but also because I think what they're going through at the heart of it is something we can all connect to.
Right. And what would you say that is? I know what I think it is, but what would you say that is?
Loss.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's loss. It's, I can only imagine, and I haven't been through this personally, but I could only imagine that, and this is through my characters, that not only is there loss, but you're not even allowed to get angry.
Right.
You're not even allowed to get angry because it's who they are, and you understand it. But then you have to look back at your life and say, either what did I miss?
Right. Or what was real?
What was real? Mm-hmm. Is there something in my life that I could have had that I didn't have because this is the person I was with? Mm-hmm. And then for those spouses and partners who were incredibly connected to each other, like Frankie and Saul were, it's losing your best friend.
Right.
So, there were a lot of things that I imagined into it. The idea of your spouse having an affair is something I think many people can connect to. Right. And there's a lot of stuff that comes just from that, which has less to do with because they're gay and more to do with, people living secret lives.
Right. But it's so fascinating to me because you manage to get the nuance and the complication of the fact that, yes, there's an affair, that's one secret, but then there's the identities of the sexualities of the husbands, which is another secret. So it's a layered secret. And I love, there's a scene in one of the early episodes of the first season where all the kids, Bud and Coyote and Bree and Mallory, go over to their dad's houses. And the kids are in the kitchen. It's the first dinner with Saul and Robert as a couple. And the kids are in the kitchen and they're like, if they had been cheating on our moms with women for 20 years, would we be over here having dinner? You hit on the double standard that's like, okay, because they're gay, we have to roll with this, as opposed to...
We have to be okay with this.
We have to be okay with, and we have to be okay with this fast. It's like, we got to be okay with this like within a couple of weeks, which is such a nuance that I think straight spouses experience in their own families. Like, everything, the whole dynamic of the family has changed completely, including the identities of the players. So it's not just the circumstances, it's who we are is fundamentally different than who we thought we were, which is so captured. Yeah.
And what we imagined our family was.
Right. Did you have, okay, I have so many questions about plot points as well, but before that, I want to ask, like, in the writer's room, did you have people who have experienced this, straight spouses, straight partners because there are so many moments, I feel like, that you nail, just even moments that if you blinked, you missed them, or maybe even moments, like there's a moment in one of the later seasons where Robert's talking about, maybe, I can't quite remember the context, but Robert's talking about having a beard in the 80s, and Jane Fonda just looks at him and goes, yeah, me.
Yeah, me.
Like,
yeah.
and that's like for straight spouses, that's a world is in those two lines. Like, there's an entire universe in those lines. And for someone who hasn't experienced this, they might quite, if you blink and you miss it. But did you have someone, or do you have somebody in the writer's room that you can be like, hey, what was this like? What does this feel like? How do you feel? How does the anger compare with the heartbreak?
Honestly, no.
Wow.
We had no one in the room who experienced it. However, a number of people in the room have friends or siblings who've been through it.
Right. Right, because it's not rare. It's not actually, it's not talked about, but it's not rare. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And, we had gay and straight and all ages. And, but no, we didn't have anybody who had personally been through it, but we had such imaginative, sensitive writers that they could imagine into it. And I think truthfully imagine into it.
Right. I feel like they did, because one of the things that's so crazy is the disclosure scene that happens in a restaurant. Season 1, episode 1. You've got Martin Sheen, who I'm a huge fan of. You've got Sam Waterston. Oh my gosh. It's unbelievable. Sitting at a dinner table, and that's when they disclose that they're gay at a restaurant. And that actually happens, Marta. There are so many.
I get it. You do it at a restaurant so they won't yell at you.
Right. Or on vacation. It happens.
Yes.
In the community of people we support, it happens on anniversaries, like a 27-year anniversary. It happens in a restaurant on vacation. And it's just like, wow, this is a fascinating phenomenon that these disclosures come in these kinds of ways. And Grace calls Robert on it. You did this to protect yourself so that I couldn't get mad at. I mean, it was so art imitating life in such a wonderful way. It was so captured the experience for straight spouses who've experienced disclosure in that kind of a way. So I commend the writers team for empathizing into the experience so deeply.
Thank you. It's one of the great experiences to be in a writer's room with people who expand their minds into situations that they haven't been in and can find what is identifiable about it.
Right. And the other thing that is so amazing about it, too, is they have to be able to say, I imagine that they are saying, like, gosh, how would I feel if this happened to me? Because what I love about Grace and Frankie is they come at it from two different angles. Like, Grace, I feel like, gets the anger piece, and Frankie gets the heartbreak piece. Like you were talking about the hurt, like the end of the first episode, Grace is like, why aren't you angry? And Frankie's like, because I'm heartbroken. And it captures like both responses are legitimate to, your whole life maybe not being what you thought it was, but how beautiful that both these women have these different responses to it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And that was very important to us that it, in a way, helps shape the characters themselves, their different approaches, but also their different marriages. I mean, Grace says to Robert, it would have been easier if you died.
And can I just tell you, I don't mean to interrupt you, Marta, but that I have heard that so many people who have experienced this can relate to that sentiment.
Let me just say, I haven't been through exactly what you're talking about, but I have been through my husband leaving me on our 30th anniversary after an affair. I mean, there are things I could connect to about it.
Right.
And that was a shameful feeling that I had. At least I was ashamed of it. Even thinking that. I have children. I mean, why would I even think that? And yet it felt so truthful in especially in Grace's position,
right?
Where for 20 years, this has been going on, and that she's now, as far as she sees, left barren, left with nothing. Everything that she built has crumbled. So for her, it's a way of the show is a way of taking back her life.
Right.
And reclaiming it.
Well, I want to talk about that because one of the things I do love about this show, which I think is such a message to straight spouses when they're able to watch it, is that this catastrophe in the women's lives, and there is focus on
and trauma
and trauma. It is real trauma. It's real trauma.
Yeah.
The catastrophe in their lives actually becomes an invitation for them to become more of who they are and to try things. I mean, I just love that Grace tries peyote and pot and a vibrator for the first time in her life as a result of this, things that she maybe never would have tried had her life continued on the same trajectory. And even though the blow up is so fierce, she is shaken up in such a way that it's like, which has happened. You're shaken up in such a way that all the pieces come down in a completely new picture.
I totally understand that. I believe that. And yet it's not something you can tell someone when they start going through it.
Yeah.
When it happens, you can't say to someone, not only are you going to be okay, you have a chance of being better.
Right.
No one's going to believe that at first. All you see is the disaster.
Right.
And it's something, that has to be experienced a little bit at a time.
Right. And I love that opening up of their lives takes place slowly over the course of the 7 seasons. And there's something else, too. We were talking about the different ways in which Grace and Frankie respond, but there's also a difference in how they get into the relationship, which I wanted to ask you about. It's so fascinating. So when one of the later seasons, we find out that Frankie's sister told her that Saul was gay. And so we have these two very different. You had Grace, who basically at some point says, I thought we had a normal marriage. I thought we were happy enough. I thought we were like everybody else. And then you have Frankie, who clearly had some information that, for reasons that she has to examine, got some information about Saul that she chose not to acknowledge. So it's too, and that mirrors, I think, what a lot of straight spouses, straight partners experience in terms of some of us did have inklings or clues that we either misinterpreted or couldn't interpret, or and this is not in a way of blame by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
Yeah, it's just I know at 19, my boyfriend at 19 had like Herb Ritz and Robert Mapplethorpe coffee table books, and I didn't realize I was from the Midwest and I was Catholic and I didn't know what that meant. So, that there are always things like when Grace goes into Robert's office and she starts seeing things that are just there that all of a sudden indicate, like, that's such a nuanced and real experience for straight spouses. So, but I love, can you talk about how having the information for Frankie to have the information prior to their marriage and then Grace not having the information prior to their marriage, those two different experiences of that.
I think there are two things about Frankie having the information. Mm-hmm. When I was first dating my 30 years later to be ex-husband, someone said they thought he was gay. Mm. Mm. Wow. And I just didn't believe it.
Yeah.
And in my case, it was true, but it was like, no, that's silly. But I think we hear things, and depending on who we hear it from,
right,
we may or may not take it seriously. Frankie had a contentious relationship with her sister.
Right.
They had a tough relationship. So I think it's possible that Frankie was just like, don't try to ruin my day.
Right. Or she could be suspicious of the motives for telling, you could be like, why would you tell me this information? Like, Are you just trying to hurt me more or something like that? Like I love that it depends on the source of where the information comes from. Yeah.
And I believe that Frankie just thought that Saul was sensitive.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And more enlightened, that he's open to all sorts of experiences. I don't think she saw it as him being literally
gay
and preferring men, because I think they had not an unhealthy sexual relationship.
Right. I think that's also very common too, that's exactly what I did. I said, well, he's so much more sophisticated than I am. He understands all of these, he understands art and philosophy and whatever I said in my 19-year-old brain,
Right.
So I love that distinction. And I also think it makes it very understandable then where Grace is so much more fiery in her response, because for her, it's like, I had no clue. No clue. And I think that is an honest reaction when you feel like, she says in one of the first episodes, I feel like the last 40 years have been a fraud. And Martin Sheen Robert says, don't be ridiculous. Only the last 20 years have been a fraud.
Right.
Which in that moment is like, ooh, like she says, you don't get to joke, but for straight spouses watch, like that is an acknowledgement that there can be an element in some of these relationships, not all, in some of these relationships, there can be an element of feeling like, was this all a lie? Was this all a fraud? Was I just a beard?
And I think that is not an uncommon feeling.
Yes.
Among a lot of people who, discover their spouses were having affairs or, whatever it is. I think that feeling of was my entire marriage a fraud is very common. I think in this case, part of it was she never imagined that this is a way the marriage could end.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Never imagined it. And as a matter of fact, she was willing to live with whatever it was.
Yeah, she was happy enough. Right. Yeah.
She was happy enough.
Right.
Which I find to be a heartbreaking statement.
Mm-hmm. It is a heartbreaking statement. Robert says to her, I thought there was more.
Yeah.
And honestly, because of the relationships dissolving, all the characters get to an opportunity to find that more, whatever that more is for them.
Right.
Well, I want to take a quick break, Marta, and then when we come back, I want to talk about Robert and Saul a little bit. So we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more Marta Kauffman. Hey, everyone. We want to give a warm shout out to all of our donors who helped us raise $8,230 in our December 2021 fundraiser. That money will fund Zoom lines for our support group meetings, engineering and editing for the Our Voices podcast, thank you on a personal level, and our general operating expenses. Your generosity is making a difference for straight partners and partners of trans people. We also want to give a personal shout out to an anonymous donor for generously sponsoring today's episode. If you want to sponsor an episode of the podcast or Zoom lines or the general operating of Our Path, go to ourpath.org and click on Ways to Give. And we're back with Marta Kauffman, creator of Grace and Frankie. So, Marta, I want to talk about Robert's character arc because one of the things that I struggled with him as a straight spouse in the beginning is the character was like, he's getting off light, man. and then there's the scene where he comes out to his mother in the nursing home.
Right.
And he comes out to his mother and she rejects him. And then he goes back to Grace and says, I'm so sorry. I know what it's like to not be loved by someone who is supposed to love you.
Right.
And he has just this moment of recognition, I think, that is so important. It's important for actual straight spouses to hear if they can get it.
Right.
It's also important for the character to be able to have that moment of redemption. And then later on, he's even the one when the couple moves in next door, next door to Saul and Robert, where it's a young couple, they're engaged, and the man
and he sees it. Yeah.
The man is so clearly gay, and they're like, should we tell the girl, the young woman, the fiance? And Saul's like, no, don't get involved. And Robert's like, we could spare her the years that we took from Grace and Frankie. We could save this from happening. And his character arc just switching into that mode of empathy, I think. What was that like, kind of discovering that for that character?
I think it was a couple things. One of them is I believe that when someone accepts who they are fully, they can then become more empathetic to those they've hurt because they can see their place in it. Mm. Mm-hmm. And I think it has to do with, in a weird way, saying this about Robert, maturity.
Yeah.
I also think that having Saul as a spouse helped soften him. Mm-hmm. In a way. And I think, once he was in a place where this is what he wanted with his life, he was able to drop some of the walls. And I actually think some of that happens in the first season when he goes to the funeral.
Oh, right.
And he experiences a moment of loss.
Right.
For me, that's the beginning of him of his journey to a more enlightened self.
I love that idea that when we can become more authentically who we are, and we are our energy is not all directed into the show, the facade, and we can drop some of that, then we have energy left over to be empathetic towards those we may have hurt. I think that's just absolutely spectacular.
Thank you.
As a message, and not that the show hits you over the head with it, but it's just like subtly in there, which is really beautiful. So there's a moment, though, too, where Grace says, she finds a box of gifts that Robert has. I think this is such a great moment. She finds a box of gifts that he has stored and wrapped up in the closet for years. And she sees these gifts and is like, is this how you managed me? And that was an interesting scene. Can you tell us how, like, what that one was about for you?
My ex-husband did that to me.
Wow. Oh my gosh.
When he moved out, I went into our safe. I had to get some papers out, and I found 21 boxes of jewelry.
Oh my gosh.
And I used to wonder, like, sometimes I'd be in a sad mood for whatever reason, and he'd bring me a present. And I was like, wow, how did he know I was going to be sad? That's kind of, and I missed it. And it was weird because he would give me doubles of things. Like he didn't even realize what he bought.
Oh, wow. Oh my gosh.
And I felt like a dog who he was handing treats out to.
Wow. Yeah.
It was so humiliating when I realized what he'd been doing all these years, just trying to keep me in a way in my place within the marriage.
Right.
And he could use it to cover up his secrets.
Right. It's so calculated to be managed in that kind of a way.
It's despicable.
Yeah.
It's really awful. And I'm not sure that Robert, or in my case, Michael, were aware that they were doing that. They were just desperate to look for ways to maintain stasis.
Right. Right. Like there probably isn't even a thought that this might be manipulative. It's just, this is what I need to do to keep things on an even keel.
Right.
Or that this, or a thought that this might be hurtful or disingenuous or just.
And the thought that we as spouses can be bought off is terrible. And yet we accepted it.
Right. I want to talk about another dynamic that I think is so fascinating that's built into the show, and that is that Grace takes layers of masks off herself, too.
Right.
It starts in that first season, in that first episode after disclosure, and she's sitting in her bedroom at her makeup desk. What do you call that? A vanity.
Vanity, yeah.
She's sitting at her vanity. She takes off her false lashes. She takes off her hair fall. She takes off the little wires that pull her eyes, open her eyes up, that make her look like she's had a little bit of a facelift. She takes off all of the mask that she puts out into the world. And we see her bare without any of that construction that she lives her whole life with. In one of the later seasons, when she meets Nick and falls in love with Nick, and she's also lying about her age.
Yeah.
She says to him when she takes her makeup off in front of him, "Can you deal with the real me?"
Yes, that is a real growth for the character. I think when she does it in the beginning, she's in a way looking at herself and saying to herself, "This is all I am."
Right.
I'm looking at myself in the mirror, this sort of naked, older woman. What kind of life does this woman have? Especially for someone who's as vain as Grace is. In the later season, when she's with Nick, she's able to say, "This is who I am."
Right.
So she's gone from, "I don't like who I see in the mirror, and I don't see how that woman can have a life," to, "This is who I am. Take me or leave me."
It's a real moment of courage for her.
Yeah.
As a character to really.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's courage. It is a way that she has stepped into herself for the first time in over 70 years. Right. Where she says, "This is me. Take me or leave me."
Right. And kind of a wonderful, that's a wonderful moment to get to as just a human being, let alone a fictional character, but as a human being, like when you finally are at a place in your life, little bit by little bit sometimes, where you can say, "Okay, this is the real me. I'm ready to let someone see the real me," which is whether it's a spouse cheating or a spouse turning out to be somebody different than what you thought or something like that, or something like what Grace and Frankie experienced. There's real trauma in being able to open yourself up and be vulnerable with new people, especially in romantic and sexual partnership going forward. It's Grace and Frankie go through Grace particularly goes through some men. She goes through Craig T. Nelson.
Yes, she does. But she's always someone who defined herself by the men in her life.
Right.
And, as a character, she learned to define herself actually by the woman in her life.
Right. I think once she has that relationship established with Frankie, which is so interesting, is that she actually has the courage then to say to a man, "This is who I really am, take it or leave it." Like, I have enough established in my life with my best friend and a new sort of foundation to my life, that the man is not necessarily the center of it.
Also, I think discovering your sexuality at that age, which is something that was very important to us when we started working on this, was that can be new and fresh at any point in your life. And that could be another one of those gifts that you get.
Right. That's exactly where I want to go next, Marta. So we'll take a quick break and then we're going to come back and talk about sex. So we'll be right back with Marta Kauffman. Hey, everyone. We want to welcome 2 new members to our board of directors, Jason Aber and Janice Mitchell. We're always looking for passionate, talented people to join our board and help us expand our mission to help straight partners and partners of trans people. If you're interested in joining the board of directors, check out ourpath.org, go to Give Support, and click on Join Our Board. And we're back with creator of Grace and Frankie, Marta Kauffman. So this is one of the things, Marta, first of all, I love that there are 2 older women, because a show like this could have easily been about 2 women in their 30s. It could have, but there's something about 2 women who are older, re-experiencing and experiencing for the first time aspects of their sexuality, discovering things perhaps for the first time at this age. And I think that's a tremendous sort of positive about the show that basically says, hey, when the shit hits the fan and your life blows apart, there's new discovery, especially in the bedroom, that can be when your relationship blows up down the road, there's a possibility for new, fun, amazing things in the bedroom. And just in your own personal relationship with your own sex. I mean, that's what the Vibrator is about.
Yes,
it's their relationship with their own sexuality. Yeah.
And saying in Grace's case, I deserve more than what I had for 40 years.
Right. Right.
That Babe, the character Babe, is the one who says to her, it's time that you discover yourself.
Right.
And gives her that vibrator. Right. And the idea that not only is she discovering her sexuality, she's learning to talk about it.
Mm. Which was not easy for her at all.
Correct. Yeah. Correct. And I think that is, one way of opening yourself up to it and not just being sort of keeping it also a secret.
Which is wonderful for women of that generation. It often is hard to speak about their sexuality.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I also think the other thing that I really appreciate about the way things went in terms of their sexuality is to also say your vagina gets dry as you get older. There's stuff you can do about that.
Right.
It's harder to have an orgasm when you get older. There's something you can do about that.
Right.
So not to just accept, I'm getting older, it's not as easy, to be able to see ourselves, especially after trauma,
right,
as sexual beings who deserve to enjoy pleasure.
Absolutely. And the other thing that is so important in their journeys is not just the opening up of the pleasure, but also the recovery from, like, there's one time when Grace talks about Robert yawning during sex.
Yeah.
And you get the feeling that, there's a nod to the idea that as if you're a woman, having sex with a gay man can be damaging.
Yeah.
To your self-esteem can be, or harmful. It can be difficult. And to recover from that, and to ask not just for more, but to say, to risk being vulnerable in an intimate setting again, when in the past it's been, your husband's. Not that heterosexual men can't yawn during sex too,
right?
But that it's something added that she has to overcome when she's exploring her sexuality.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And to know that it wasn't her.
Right. It wasn't her.
Because of the way the relationship went. And they were at the point, I think, in this relationship where they hadn't had sex in years.
Right.
And I to understand that wasn't all her.
Right. She has that line where she's like, turns out sex is pretty good when your husband when the man you're with isn't closing his eyes and pretending you're a man.
Yeah.
So it's like important for her to know that it wasn't her, that it was never her.
Right.
Yeah, that's so
Right.
yeah, it's I know that is super that idea I think is super validating for straight partners, straight spouses who have experienced that before. When you come to this space of, oh, that wasn't me. It wasn't about my desirability. It wasn't about it was a fundamental mismatch in our orientations, but it wasn't about me. Yeah.
And not only in terms of sexuality, but I also think learning that you are lovable.
Mm.
I think in the case of Grace and Robert, it was not a marriage that had a whole lot of love.
Right.
And I think Grace got to the point where she felt unlovable and then, in a way, made herself that.
Made herself unlovable.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Wow. That's a really interesting really interesting one to sit with for a minute, is that when the outside of our relationships, the externals of our relationships show us one thing, then we can kind of take that on into ourselves as well.
Right.
If I'm feeling like I'm unlovable because I'm being treated like I'm unlovable, then I make myself unlovable.
Then I make myself unlovable. Exactly.
Right. Oh my gosh. So Marta, there's another thing I want to ask you about. It happened really early in season 1, and it's right after Disclosure or Discovery, and Brianna and Mallory are with Grace, and Grace is sobbing at the kitchen table or the dining room table, and they're like, "We're going to get you into a group of people like you," and I think it's Brianna's like, "There's a group for women who have gay husbands," or something like that. And I'm looking at the TV going, yes, there is. That's us. That's our path, formerly the Straight Spouse Network. We've been around for 30 years. And I was wondering if there was ever a moment in the writer's room where you thought about doing that, like taking it into the group setting of a group of people who have had, because it's also Ross in Friends. His first wife left him for a woman. And so I know it's like this theme has been around in your writing career. And so I wonder if you ever had a thought of taking them into a group setting.
I'll tell you why we didn't. I mean, we talked about it, but Grace and Frankie had each other. That was their group.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah.
And, the idea, and it was more for us about these two women having to go back into society for people who don't understand. Right. The group setting is, I think, amazing and wonderful. Dramatically, people sort of just talking about it isn't necessarily going to give you story.
Right. It's not the most riveting scene.
Right.
Yeah.
But the idea of, Grace having to see all of her friends for the first time, and sort of walk in with this written all over her.
Right.
To us was just more dramatic and had more conflict.
Right. And also the conflict of like what happens with the family. Like there's a scene at a funeral with Christine Lottie, I believe, who is Robert's sister, basically telling Grace she's uninvited to her niece's baby shower because of all that's happened, and the shame of that, and the sort of the ick of that, and not just that the family is completely different now and everything's changed and the dynamic is awkward. And so you feel like you kind of got this sort of taint about you that other people don't want to be around you now. And how do you navigate the changing of the family dynamic? And that too was just such a common experience.
I totally get that, because the dynamic completely changes. And, I love the word taint, because I think that would be how somebody would feel. Right. You walk into a room and the word fool is written across your forehead. Right. But it's actually one of the reasons that the relationship between Grace and Frankie was so important, that because they have this common experience, as in any group, they help lift each other and carry each other and take care of each other and connect with each other to make their feelings more normalized in their minds.
Right. And that's such an important thing, I think, in this experience or any experience of trauma or loss, is to normalize all of those big feelings, to normalize all of those ugly, difficult feelings.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, Marta, I'm trying not to fangirl really hard. And I wonder if I don't know, is there a shout out that maybe you could give to straight spouses, the everyday regular Graces and Frankies that are plugging along and that are, or the everyday Rosses, to go back to friends, who've experienced this and I don't know. Is there something that you could say?
There are a couple things I'd love to say.
Yeah.
To all the women and men who have been through this. And I know they know this, but I have to say that most people don't view them as the ones who missed something. Most people will look at you and say, "Oh my God, you have been deceived." And most people, I believe, their hearts truly understand. Yeah. And I think the ones who try to get out of a good conversation about it, and the people who run away and uninvite you, are not the people you want in your lives.
Right.
The people you want in your lives are the ones who are going to give you a vibrator.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't know if there's a better way to end the conversation than that, Marta. That seems like it's sort of a moral of the universe. It ought to be.
Yes,
like the people you want in the lives are the ones who are going to give you a really damn good vibrator.
That's right. That's right.
Or whatever the equivalent is for men.
That's right.
Well, Marta, thank you so much for being on the show today. It was such a pleasure and delight to talk to you.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. And thank you for your really thoughtful questions.
Oh, thank you. And just knowing that there's a show out there. I mean, actually, I'll say this too. I think it's becoming more. It's weaving its way into plot lines. Bridgerton on Netflix had a tiny little thread plot line. I think I May Destroy You on HBO had a tiny little plot. Coming Out Colton is on Netflix right now. And Colton Underwood from The Bachelor was, he was like, I would have gone through with a marriage. Right. And so I think that the more these stories get out there, the more we can begin talking about what it means to be authentic in relationships of all kinds, and what it means to be really ourselves and not hiding within relationship, and what happens to people when they hide within relationship, and on all levels. And so just on a personal note, I'd be a fan even if I wasn't a straight spouse, because I mean, the four leads are just absolutely, come on. But I think, I mean, what can you possibly say? But, I think that there is a sense that the more these stories get out there and we can talk about being authentic in relationships, the more we can actually have permission to be authentic in our relationships. So I want to thank you for putting the story of Grace and Frankie and straight spouses and straight partners out there into the world in such a huge way.
Thank you. That's very sweet. Thank you.
Thanks to our listeners for tuning in today. Be on the lookout for all new episodes on the 1st and 15th of every month. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. This is a reminder that the views of the host, yours truly, are not necessarily the views of Our Path or its board of directors. Thank you to our engineer, Drew, right here at Gwyn Sound in Cincinnati, Ohio. And until next time, this is your host, Kristen, reminding you, keep using your voice.